I'm beginning to think. Yes, I'm beginning to think. Thoughts become me.
Welcome to The Cost of Not Paying Attention, hosted by nationally recognized speaker Janine Hamner Holman. Janine knows what it takes to attract and retain world-class talent. Join her here each week on The Cost of Not Paying Attention as we use brain science, leadership, management, and real-life challenges managers face to explore the places where we aren't paying attention.
Welcome to The Cost of Not Paying Attention. I'm your host, Janine Hamner Holman. What am I paying attention to today? The number of articles that we are seeing in the news about toxic workplaces. You know, recently something came out again about what's going on at Twitter. Something came out about the way that Kanye West has been working with his people. It's just news story after news story. Just yesterday, an article came out from the Mayo Clinic looking at ways in which organizations have toxicity in them and what to do about it. Because the reality is that the impact of being in a toxic work environment, which it goes on a wide spectrum. There's all kinds of toxicity from, really being bullied to microaggressions and everything in between. And it has an impact on us physically and psychologically. And so that brings me right to our guest for today. I'm so excited that Michele Simon is here with us all the way from Australia, y'all. And she is, am I wrong about that? Are you not in Australia?
No, we're close. I'm in California.
You're in California.
Yep.
Huh. I got that completely wrong. And she is an expert in helping people in particular get out of toxic work environments. And so welcome to the show, Michele.
Thank you for having me, Janine.
You're welcome. I am so glad to have you here with us. So tell me, what is something that you have noticed that people are not paying attention to? And what is the cost of that?
I think you described the range well of, what a toxic workplace can look like. My background is in public health and law, and I only came to this really through a personal experience of somebody who tricked me for over 2 years. He pretended to be my friend and then decided to steal everything I had built. And so, yeah. So I think, the phrase workplace bullying has been around a while, and, most people know that by this sort of typical bullying behavior, right? Of just being a mean boss or something like that. But what I've found, based on what happened to me and talking to a lot of others, mostly women who've experienced this, is the more covert behavior. So Merriam-Webster just announced that the word of the year is gaslighting.
Oh my goodness.
Right. Which of course can occur in a lot of contexts, but is particularly prevalent in the workplace, right?
Yeah.
So, gaslighting is when you complain about something and someone says, what are you talking about? No, that was your fault. So really making you question your own reality. And so I think what we're not paying attention to is all of the covert behaviors that can go on at work. And even the word microaggression, which is often used to describe, say, a racist or gendered remark, is probably minimizing really the potential harm. So, we know that at least 1/3 of people in the US experience some form of bullying at work. I think it's probably higher. And, not just emotional toll that takes, but the physical toll. We know there's so many connections between, our mental health and physical health. I mean, it's ridiculous to even talk about those two as separate. It's really just health. The consequences can be quite devastating. I mean, there are even many reports of suicide from people who have been, bullied in some form or another
Right.
over time. But particularly, I'm interested in the more covert behaviors that aren't always easy to spot. In my case, it was completely behind my back. I didn't know what was going on until it was way too late. For other people, they may have a sense that something's off, but again, it's that, questioning your reality, and that can really have very negative impacts on your health and obviously your work performance, et cetera.
Yeah. And so I too have had that sort of experience, both covert and overt. I had a boss at one point who I found out from other people who were in a more senior position had been bad mouthing me in senior leadership meetings that I wasn't participating in, but I was finding it out from
Mm.
these friends.
Yeah.
And it's one of those tricky situations where I was happy to know that my boss didn't have my back. I was happy to be able to sort of have my guard up, and yet sort of like, well, what do I do about that? She's my boss. And so when people find themselves in those sorts of situations where it really is covert, where it's not being done directly to your face, when things are being said about you in other situations, what are effective strategies that you have become aware of and that you really work with folks that you work with directly? You really
Mhm.
work with them to help them implement these strategies.
Yeah. Well, unfortunately, when you're on the receiving end of a smear campaign and you get an inkling of it, it's probably already too late,
Yeah,
and there really isn't a lot you can do, especially if your boss is directly involved in it. I mean,
right.
obviously, often your boss is being, the smear campaign is being directed to your boss. So people are, engaging in a whisper campaign about you, what have you. Other than trying to have a direct conversation with your boss, which, you can try if you can start to get
Right.
clues. I would say if, like you found out, sadly, your boss doesn't have your back, then there is really next to nothing you can do. The only option there could be is if you're in a big enough company to ask for a transfer.
Yeah.
But every company is different for how they handle that sort of thing. And really at that point, the only option is to get out. So that's generally what I do is I help women exit their toxic workplaces, because they're really, one of my pet peeves is seeing articles out there like top 10 ways to handle your toxic boss or whatever. And it's like, there really is no handling a toxic situation except to get out as quickly as possible. Now, of course, not many people are able to just quit, and I understand that. But, there definitely are, when I think of managing, I think of more just sort of short-term meditation techniques or things that you
Uh-huh.
need to do to kind of manage your day-to-day stress. Because I have one client that, I mean, her stress escalated into a full-on, physical problem. And so, there are techniques, I mean, they're kind of standard meditation techniques, minimizing contact with the toxic person, just doing everything you can to protect yourself, put boundaries around, your time, and take as, I always start with, how many vacation days do you have? I just
Yeah.
talked to a friend yesterday. She had forgotten that she had a contract when she started her job that gave her 4 weeks vacation. And I said, oh, really? How much have you taken? And of course, not all of it. So just really taking stock in what do you have available to you to minimize your contact with these toxic people, whether it's literally taking time off
Mhm.
or, blocking certain people from contacting you. One client has someone who just contacts her randomly all day long. And I said, you got to just, not answer. So just finding ways to protect yourself, your boundaries, your health, while you then create, the exit plan
Right.
to permanently get out of that situation.
Yeah, so I have a client, that I have been working with now for a while, and I did a workshop with with their entire leadership. So their entire manager team. So anybody who is managing anybody else, about 128 people. And we were having this really interesting, big conversation about what is the impact on us when we have a manager who is anywhere in that spectrum, in the bullying or just not very nice to be with, that just makes you want to put your head down on your desk and take a nap all day long. And so, like, how does it make us feel when we are in that situation? And so we had this big whiteboard with lots of words on it, demoralized and stupid and ineffective. And then one person, not surprisingly, a young person, said, I would leave if I were in that situation.
Yeah.
And I said, that's so magnificent. And I'm so glad that you are bringing that up.
Right.
Here was the reality for me. I was in this kind of a situation. And of course, it's not every day, all day that you're in that situation. And
Right.
and there is a frog in the pot of boiling water thing that happens. And then sometimes it's great and everything is good. And you feel like, oh, maybe it really was all my imagination. And then, of course, it goes back to being what it was. And I said, I was in this situation for 9 years.
Wow.
And the reality was that by the time I finally left, it had taken a huge toll on me physically and psychologically. And, I very much felt like I had PTSD or, something else where I had really lost in many ways my sense of self and my sense of self-efficacy and my sense of, being a competent human. And in that land between I would leave, I would get up and walk out the door, and me who stuck it out for 9 years, hoping that things would just magically get better. How can we shorten the period of time that people who are in the camp like me stick around in that situation?
Right. Well, I do think there is a growing awareness. I mean, that young person you mentioned is sort of, indicative of, I think, the next generation that is just saying, yeah, I'm not taking that. Right. So that's good.
Which is part of why, it is great for them. And it is what is leading to the Great Resignation and the Great Reorganization.
Totally.
And, because they're not willing to tolerate those sorts of situations.
Right. But even beyond the younger generation, I mean, we have, COVID obviously just kind of laid bare so many of these problems. And, now you have not only the Great Resignation, but the great thing, working from home.
Right.
And who can blame them? Who wants to be in a toxic office when, at least when you're home, you can deflect a lot of the BS that happens in the office. Although I will say there's evidence that even virtually, a lot of, these especially covert kind of power play behaviors can go on. I mean, for me, I remember feeling like Slack was being weaponized against me, where there'd be this weird ganging up happening, or somebody would try to embarrass me. It's just like, really? I mean, so I mean, it can happen both virtually and in the real office setting. And, what you described as, when you mentioned PTSD, I do think it's important to talk about the harm that can come from this type of behavior, particularly over time, as a form of trauma. And, I think that is becoming more recognized, workplace trauma. And I think it is important to call it that and recognize it as that. And so what can happen is, after you've experienced workplace trauma and, in your recovery, or then, especially if you go too soon to the next workplace, that PTSD happens, right? So you may, something will trigger you. A boss will say something that feels like what your other boss said. And even though, it's really different, you get reminded of it and you react, and then your body goes right back into that place of like protection, freeze, fight, the various reactions to feeling under threat. And so it's really important to heal from a traumatic work situation. And, what I always recommend, if possible, is to take time between, that's why it's the hardest thing is to talk to someone who is in a situation, cannot quit, and then, can only leave by getting another job. Right. And while I understand most people are, obviously economically in that situation, I also like to discuss the possibility of taking some time in between. Sometimes you can negotiate with a new employer, particularly if you're, a high level or specialized field where they really need you. Then they will allow for, they may give you some extra time. And you can honestly say, I need, to be at my best for this new role, I need time to downtime in between. And, a good employer will actually
will understand and respect that.
Yes. Yes. Yeah. I would say a bad sign is an employer who says, no, I'm not going to give you any time. We need you yesterday. Like, you don't really even want to go into that situation. Yeah. So, I just really think it's so important to take the time to recover. And I also always recommend, I'm a sort of somewhere between a therapist and an attorney in how I help people. But I understand both worlds, but I also understand sometimes the need for almost always a trained therapist, which I'm not. And so to talk to someone who understands, particularly as trauma informed. So not all therapists, what I had to learn the hard way, let me save you lots of time. Not all therapists actually understand trauma. So it wasn't until I found the right therapist that I was able to truly heal. And also someone who understands if you are victimized by someone with narcissistic tendencies, which is also very common. I wound up working with someone who specialized in narcissism, and that was extremely helpful to understand, the behavior that was behind what happened to me. So the more specialized you can find someone to help you recover from that trauma, the better. And then, I always like to throw out there the potential for getting some kind of severance, on your way out the door. Obviously, if they're letting you go, then you're in a better position to negotiate. But even if you want to quit, sometimes it is possible to get your employer to give you severance if there was some kind of, illegal activity going on, right? Like outright discrimination or retaliation, then, you're in a better position. Unfortunately, most of the behaviors we've been talking about, just straight up bullying or even stealing your work or certainly gaslighting are not actionable, as we say in law. Right. But what I do is I start to probe for were you paid differently if you're a woman, than a man? Were you treated differently than men if they're in another protected class? Like oftentimes, there's a combination of things going on, right? So somebody who, and by the way, age discrimination is obviously very common, difficult to prove, but the threshold for that is just age 40. So, there's a lot of potential for bringing in potential ways to threaten an employer to leverage getting some kind of severance out of the arrangement. And the reason I really like to stress that is that goes back to what we were just talking about, to get time, to really give yourself the time financially, the bridge that you need to recover from the toxic situation that you are coming from before you jump to the next job. So obviously severance pay can help with that.
And I want to bring up two things. One is a part of a book that I want to introduce into this conversation, really looking at some of the differences between men and women. Before I do that, though, it was not my exit strategy. It ended up being the beginning of my exit, but it was not my strategy to go out on medical leave. But I knew I was in trouble. I knew I was having a hard time managing myself. And so I actually went to my doctor and said, I think I need to go on antidepressants. And after talking with me for a very brief period of time, his response was, you actually need to go out on medical leave. And that ended up granting me the gift of time
Mm-hmm.
to make that happen. So this is from the Harvard Business Review. And when we're looking, when we're talking about what's happening with incivility in the workplace, part of why I love this graph is in 1998, when this begins, about 25% of people had experienced incivility in the workplace. Now, this is at, actually the bar lines are not showing I don't know why, but it is now at 99%. That's that top number. 99% of people are experiencing incivility, again,
Wow.
across a whole spectrum in the workplace, according to
Right.
the Harvard Business Review. So before we get into a little bit more about the differences between men and women, do you have any thoughts on that, Michele?
Yeah, I have a couple of thoughts. I mean, there's two ways to look at that, right? One
Yeah.
is, oh my God, we've, increased. And I think there may be some increase because it is true that, especially in the last administration, we had sort of this no holds barred, like anything goes, and the Twitter type of crazy leadership. And so I do think there is legitimate increase. But I also think that, back in the day, we just didn't really talk about it, or we didn't identify it, and maybe that word wasn't really being used the way it is today. So I think it's probably some combination of not having identified it previously to like, yes, things have gotten worse.
Yeah. And one of the things that I find fascinating is because I got into neurobiology and brain science about 15 years ago, and our brain does not immediately distinguish between something bad, me seeing something bad happening to you, and it happening to me. And our brain is wired, because we are so wired to be sensitive to, am I safe? That is, a whole parts of our brain are just designated to, am I safe? If something bad happens to you in the workplace and I see it, I'm not even party to it, not even your best friend at work, I just see it happening.
Right.
It has an impact on me too. And so I think that our sensitivity to it has also changed dramatically.
Yeah, that's interesting, though. That could also work in a negative way, in that fear or that sense of safety or lack of safety often means that your coworkers who you thought might actually come to your defense or help you in some way don't. And instead they retreat and just protect themselves. And so that's something that affects, everybody in some way or another who is experiencing workplace abuse. And that is really what we're talking about, is, the betrayal, right? So I talk about the different layers of betrayal. So there's sort of the initial betrayal of, in my case, somebody who I thought I could trust turned out to be completely undermining me. And then there's what's called institutional betrayal. And so that's when how the company responds, how your boss responds, et cetera. And that usually doesn't go very well either. The third layer is your colleagues, your coworkers, who, some of them might do the right thing and speak up, but let's be honest, most of them are not. Right? They're just going to close ranks and abandon you, frankly. And that's what happened to me. So it's multi-layered, and that's why, again, therapy, so important to unpack all of that.
So important and so helpful. And so I want to read you a little bit here from this book, which is On the Shoulders of Mighty Women by my good friend, Leslie Michaels. And I was actually asked to contribute to it. So this is from page 61. And what it says is, in her seminal work, Mindset, the New Psychology of Success, author and researcher Dr. Carol S. Dweck writes, many females have a problem, not only with stereotypes, but also with others' opinions of them in general. They trust them too much. Girls learn to trust other people's estimates of them. Boys are constantly being scolded and punished. When we observed in grade school classrooms, we saw boys got 8 times more criticism than girls for their conduct. Boys are also constantly calling each other slobs and morons. The evaluations, therefore, lose a lot of their power. What Dr. Dweck is pointing to is the drastically different ways in which cisgender boys and girls are socialized, both by their caregivers and by each other. Girls are praised for being cute, sweet, polite, pretty, and nice. Through this, they learn to praise and evaluate others for these same and similar qualities. Boys are physically and verbally aggressive for each other, jokes about farts and other bodily functions while calling each other names. As a result, and as a group in which there tend to be lots of exceptions, women tend to be impacted more severely and deeply by harsh criticism than men. Let me be clear, men are affected too. Toxic work environments are horrible for people regardless of gender. What I am emphasizing here is that women are significantly more likely to internalize the criticism and experience it as doing harm. So because a lot of your work is focused on women in particular, I thought that this was an important element to bring into it, that women are wired both, in our brain science, in our brain chemistry, we're literally wired. And then by society, we're further wired to be really impacted in negative ways by criticism, especially when it extends over time.
Right. I would say what comes to the front for me is we're supposed to be perfectionists, right? Most women are perfectionists, and that we're supposed to be good girls, but we're also supposed to be nice. So, so when we get criticized, of course, we're going to internalize it, and we're not going to speak out. We're not going to defend ourselves either. Right? So it's like this awful combination of like, we internalize it, but we're too nice to complain about it. Because if we complain,
but we're not supposed to complain about it.
We're not complain. And if we do, then of course that just creates more gaslighting and backlash. So women
now
are
we're
in
a bitch and a problem.
Exactly.
Yeah. So when you are working with folks and working to help them figure out how to get a break, how to create a transition for themselves. If there are folks who are listening or watching us now, in addition to taking care of ourselves while we're still in this situation, are there any other things that we can and should be, in addition to reaching out to you directly and saying, hey, I would like to work with you, I need some help? What are other things that people can be doing?
Yes. So I like to recommend that you kind of shore up your resources, right? So in addition to sort of immediate self-care, we talked about also, like for me, it was helpful to kind of dig back into earlier friendships in my life. I mean, people who I was still in touch with, but to lean on them a lot. Like, obviously in addition to my partner who got me through this, but to go back to the people who really knew you when, and who, really care about you and will give you, the time that you need to process what's going on. So get out of the work environment where you really can't trust anybody and go to the people who love you and knew you and really, will let you lean on them. And so in addition to the professional therapist that you can't, spend all your money there, you're like, go get your therapy for free from the people who really love you, right?
Yeah.
And then, from there, other resources like, pets, taking walks on the beach, or, whatever nature you have near you, just like thinking about showing up your resources, right? To get breaks, to just really, give yourself that strength. And I can't emphasize enough this idea of really leaning on people in your lives. I mean, that is really what saved me. And, we tend to think, oh, that person will be too busy. And you know what? Most people really are happy to help. And so I think just really making sure that you go to the resources that you have available to you, both professionally and personally.
I think one of the challenges often for humans, and maybe especially for women, is remembering to rely on our resources. Like we get into, especially professional women, we get into this, like, I need to be able to stand on my own. I need to be able to do it myself.
Right.
And I used to have a Post-it on my computer that said, the smartest people look for their resources and ask for help.
There you go. Yes, absolutely. And, women, of course, as caregivers, are always the first to be taking care of everyone else around us. But, our, energy gets drained. And you're right. We absolutely need to allow others to take care of ourselves, of us when we need it.
Awesome. As an attorney, and this is my last question before we start wrapping up. And so if there's other things that you want to bring in, please do. As an attorney, one of the things that we often hear in situations is you want to start documenting everything.
Right.
How important really is that?
It is important. I will say it's more important where you think you have a legally actionable case, but obviously most people don't know who aren't lawyers, whether they do or not. So it's always good just, when in doubt, to document. And I think it's useful, even regardless of whether you bring a case. First of all, it's always good, even if you want to ask for severance. So, what I always tell people is, like, start with your accomplishments. Like, so just documenting everything that you've done in a positive way at work is always good to have if it's not already available. And then, of course, any interaction that, where someone's trying to gaslight you, to create evidence to the contrary. So yes, documentation is important. I don't want people to get too crazy over it. Some people are better at it than others, but I would say key conversations, so like if you talk to your boss and they said one thing and that contradicted something else, whatever, like certain things that you think you might come in handy later on, definitely document. And you can do the lawyer thing, which is after you have either in-person or a phone call, send a follow-up email, summarizing what you talked about. You don't have to do that. You can also just, keep a written record for yourself. You don't have to necessarily send it via email, but depending on the situation, either one is good. So yes, I do think documentation is important, and also consulting an attorney before you think you need to. So one mistake people make is they think they only need an attorney if they're going to sue. Well, I don't want to sue. It's like, lawyers don't only sue. Lawyers help you, understand the situation that you're in and ask the right questions, and can kind of guide you on, like the documentation piece that you might need no matter what path you take. And then again, like, with requesting severance, negotiating the terms of severance, and so forth. So, the sooner, if you have any suspicion that there's wrongdoing going on, the other reason is retaliation is almost certain to happen. Mm-hmm. So once you complain about something, documenting potential retaliation, having a lawyer who can help you, because retaliation is absolutely illegal when it's regarding an underlying illegal activity. So these are kinds of reasons it's good to, just consult a lawyer sooner rather than later.
Awesome. So obviously, this is a challenging subject. It is a place where it can be hard for us who are survivors of these kinds of situations to talk about it. It can be hard when people are realizing, oh crap, I am in a bad situation that I probably need to do something about this. Right. And often, as you said, often the only thing to do is to leave. And so then how do we figure out how to make that happen? So Michele, I really want to thank and appreciate you for your wisdom on all of this, and also for your honesty and your authenticity and your willingness to talk about things that are difficult and challenging and bring up lots of feelings and emotions. So I really want to thank you and appreciate you for being here with us today, and also for the work that you are doing, helping people get out of these situations.
My pleasure. Thank you for making the space to have these hard conversations. And I think, what makes them so hard is that often we feel alone in them.
Right.
And so, that's why it's so important that we do talk about it. And, I can't tell you how many women have reached out just to thank me for like a LinkedIn post. I mean, which seems like so simple, but it's because we tend to, again, women, men do this too, but just in general, we tend to suffer in silence, right?
Yep.
And so, it is really important to make sure people understand you're not alone. It's not you, it's them. Get out, move on to a healthier situation, take care of yourself. That is the most important thing.
And that's one of the things I think can also be helpful about documenting is that it can sort of be a form, an easier way maybe into something like journaling, like because it can help us to see, okay, this really isn't me. I'm not crazy. I'm not imagining this. There is, in fact, something going on here.
Yes.
And
absolutely.
I'm actually not the problem.
Right. And seeing the patterns. So, the first time it's easy to dismiss, right? Okay. But when as soon as you notice the second time, go back and write down that first time, because that's when you start seeing the patterns. And and that is when you absolutely realize it's not you, it's them. And, the other thing I'll say is, I think, again, as women in the caretaker role, I often hear, and I had this feeling too, well, I can't leave because of the other, I feel responsible for my team, or, the department will just fall apart without me, which, they will falter, yes, but really everything will go, keep going, and you can't save the other people on your team. You got to save yourself and
put on your oxygen mask first.
Right. Exactly.
Yeah. All right. Well, thank you again so much. This has been a wonderful, rich, and enlightening conversation.
My pleasure. Thanks so much for having me. I really enjoyed it.
It's been my honor. I am Janine Hamner Holman, and this has been The Cost of Not Paying Attention. Remember, great leaders make great teams. Until next time.
On behalf of Janine Hamner Holman, thanks for paying attention. This has been The Cost of Not Paying Attention. Head on over to our website, www.janinehamner.com/podcast, for access to the show notes as well as additional resources. Remember, great leaders make great teams.